Mug police officer walks into court, confident that his reputation will carry him through the day. He sees a single mother on the bench and can't resist cracking a joke, mocking her situation. What he doesn't realize is that this single mother is actually the judge presiding over the case. Justice is about to take a turn he never saw coming. Before jumping to main twist, quickly comment down from where in the world you are watching and also subscribe the channel for more stories. Officer James Jimmy Taylor strutted into the courtroom, his ego practically leading the way like a peacock showing off its feathers. To him, this was familiar territory. The courtroom was his playground, and the badge pinned to his chest was his golden ticket to ride roughshod over anyone who dared oppose him. He had strutted into this very room countless times before, always managing to win, not because he was particularly brilliant, but because he knew how to wield intimidation like a weapon. His towering frame, square jaw, and steely gaze had often done most of the talking. The badge on his chest filled in the gaps, and if all else failed, his bullying demeanor was enough to silence any murmurs of resistance. Today, though, Jimmy felt more invincible than usual. He was up against someone he deemed barely worth his time, a woman. But not just any woman. She was a single mother, according to the file he had skimmed while eating his breakfast. In his mind, that meant she was just another struggling, frazzled, and likely desperate person. Someone whose life was already crumbling at the edges, juggling a job, kids, and whatever poor choices had landed her here. He didn't need to know her story, he had seen enough like her before. They all played out the same way. He'd press, they'd crack, and his case would be won before the judge even banged the gavel. He figured this one would be no different. As he strolled deeper into the courtroom, he gave the room a cursory glance, his sharp eyes sweeping over the benches, filled with quiet murmuring spectators and bored-looking lawyers. His gaze eventually landed on the judge's bench, and that's when his lip curled into an almost imperceptible smirk. A woman sat there, older than he expected, with tired eyes and her hands busy shuffling through a mountain of paperwork. She looked overworked, underrested, and completely unthreatening. Perfect, he thought. Just what I needed. His smirk grew as he pictured how easily this would go down. To him, she wasn't a figure of authority, she was a formality, just another tired bureaucrat who would nod along as he presented his case, barely paying attention. She probably had her own laundry list of problems to deal with and wouldn't bother questioning anything he said. Jimmy could almost hear the gavel slamming in his favor already. After all, he had seen judges like her before, too older, overworked, and all too eager to clear their docket by the end of the day. This is going to be a breeze, he thought, his mind already wandering to what he might grab for lunch after this inevitable win. Maybe he'd even stop for a celebratory drink. The courtroom was practically his personal stage, and he had already written the script. He was utterly ignorant of the storm brewing just beyond his line of sight, oblivious to the fact that his easy win was about to turn into the hardest fall of his career. As the trial commenced, Jimmy leaned back in his chair, barely paying attention. His mind was already on autopilot, coasting through the proceedings. Every now and then, he'd glance over at the woman sitting across from him, the defendant, expecting to see what he always saw, fear, desperation, maybe a few nervous glances toward the clock as if time could save her from the inevitable. But this one was different. She sat quietly, her hands folded in her lap, not fidgeting, not breaking a sweat. She wasn't doing the usual shuffle of papers or stealing anxious looks toward her lawyer for reassurance. If anything, she seemed oddly composed, too composed for someone Jimmy thought was in way over her head. But Jimmy didn't think much of it. He had seen people put on brave faces before, right before they crumbled. That's all this was, a mask. So, naturally, he decided to push a little. He started throwing condescending glances her way, almost daring her to react. In his mind, she was just a single mom, struggling to keep her head above water in a world that was always 2 steps ahead of her. He figured she was probably too exhausted from dealing with life's curveballs to offer much of a fight today. When his moment to speak finally arrived, Jimmy leaned forward slightly, his tone dripping with arrogance. He had his performance planned out from the start. "It must be hard," he began, his voice taking on a saccharine, almost patronizing sweetness. His words were laced with false sympathy, the kind that made everyone else in the room cringe. "Raising a child and still trying to understand the law. That's not for everyone, you know. He paused for effect, waiting to see if she'd break under the pressure. I mean, it's tough enough for people who actually have the training and experience, he continued, letting out a soft, arrogant chuckle. In that moment, Jimmy expected her to react the way so many others had before. She'd drop her gaze, maybe mumble something incoherent under her breath, flustered and unsure of how to respond to his overt dismissal. He was used to watching defendants shrink, used to watching his words hit their mark and tear away whatever shreds of dignity they had left. But this time, something different happened. Instead of bowing her head, the woman slowly raised it. Her movements were measured, deliberate, as if she was doing it on purpose just to make him wait. Then, she locked eyes with him. Her gaze wasn't weak or pleading, it was sharp, piercing even. Her eyes burned with a quiet fire that sent a shiver down his spine. It wasn't the look of someone defeated or overwhelmed. It was the look of someone with control. Someone who had power. Jimmy shifted in his seat, the cocky smirk slipping ever so slightly from his face. For a moment, he felt an unsettling prickling sensation crawl up his spine. It was foreign to him, this sudden sense of discomfort, this unsettling vibe radiating from the woman who had, until just a second ago, seemed like an easy target. He brushed it off, telling himself she was just trying to put on a brave face, a last-ditch effort to assert herself before he steamrolled the case. But something in her eyes made it hard to look away. It wasn't fear, it was something else entirely, something that Jimmy couldn't quite put his finger on but knew, instinctively, he didn't like. He chuckled again, this time more nervously than before, trying to shake off the moment. But deep down, in some small part of his mind, a seed of doubt had already been planted, though he'd never admit it. He straightened up, trying to regain his composure, but the unsettling feeling lingered, gnawing at him from the inside. As the trial progressed, the cocky air Jimmy had walked in with began to thin, replaced by something he hadn't felt in a courtroom in years, unease. At first, he tried to shake it off. This was supposed to be easy. He had dealt with cases like this 100 times. But something was gnawing at him, something subtle yet persistent, like a drip of water carving away at stone. The tension in the room was shifting, and not in his favor. He glanced around, trying to catch a glimpse of the crowd, but it wasn't them, it was her. The woman, sitting quietly and unflinching, had barely spoken, but each time she did, her words carried weight. Her voice didn't waver or crack under the pressure like he had expected. No, it sliced through the air with an authority that made even the most seasoned courtroom regulars sit a little straighter. Every argument she made was calculated, sharp, and disturbingly precise. This wasn't the chaotic, emotional plea he had anticipated. There was no stammering or scrambling for a defense. She knew what she was doing. Jimmy's smile, the one that had come so easily earlier, faltered. The confidence that once filled the room felt like it was evaporating, leaving him exposed. The more she spoke, the more it became painfully clear that she wasn't just holding her own, she was systematically dismantling him. Piece by piece, argument by argument, she tore through his case, revealing the gaping holes he had tried to patch with arrogance and intimidation. It wasn't supposed to go this way. He had carefully constructed this case, stacked it just right so that any push from the other side would make it topple in his favor. But now, it was him feeling like he was standing on unstable ground. His case, the one he had been so sure of, was unraveling in front of him, thread by thread. She was too damn good at this. For the first time in a long time, Jimmy felt like he was on the back foot. His carefully rehearsed points felt flimsy in comparison to her razor-sharp retorts. Every time he tried to regain the upper hand, she was already 2 steps ahead, knocking him back down with ease. It felt like he was being undressed, layer by layer, in front of the entire courtroom. His arguments, his reputation, his ego, all laid bare under her unrelenting scrutiny. Who was this woman? She wasn't acting like a terrified defendant scrambling for a defense. She was too calm, too collected. He couldn't figure it out, and that gnawing feeling in his gut only grew stronger. His mind raced, trying to make sense of it. Why was she so damn good at this? She had the kind of legal knowledge and courtroom presence that rivaled even the top lawyers he'd faced. But that didn't make sense, none of this made sense. He had pegged her as a single mother, out of her depth, clinging to whatever legal scraps her overworked public defender could provide. And then, like a freight train barreling through his mind, it hit him. Hard. He froze, his heart sinking. The realization came with a sudden, bone-chilling clarity, and the smirk he had worn earlier vanished completely. His pulse quickened as he replayed the last few minutes in his head, the way she spoke, the authority she wielded. She wasn't a regular defendant. No, she wasn't some overworked mother who didn't know how to navigate the law. He was staring down someone who had mastered it. In the midst of a particularly biting cross-examination, the atmosphere in the courtroom thickened, the tension palpable. Jimmy, still trying to salvage what little control he thought he had left, was halfway through his next point when the woman across from him, who had, up until now, been nothing more than a quiet, steady presence, paused. It was subtle at first, almost imperceptible. She adjusted her papers with an unhurried motion, carefully setting them down on the table in front of her as if she were gathering her thoughts. But then, in a move so deliberate and calculated, she leaned forward just a fraction, her eyes never leaving his, and spoke. Her voice sliced through the air, cold, precise, and commanding. "I am Judge Maria Coleman," she declared, her words hanging in the room like a thunderclap. "And I will be presiding over this case today." The room fell into stunned silence. It was as though time itself had stopped. Every person in the courtroom froze in place, as if they were waiting for the next move in some carefully orchestrated chess game. Jimmy's world, in that instant, crumbled. The ground beneath him felt like it had disappeared, leaving him dangling, suspended in shock and disbelief. His stomach turned, and his pulse, which had been steady from years of courtroom battles, suddenly hammered in his chest. He felt his breath catch, his mouth dry. The smug grin that had been a permanent fixture on his face vanished as quickly as it had come, replaced by a blank stare of sheer terror. Judge Maria Coleman. Judge Maria Coleman. He had been so blind, so arrogantly dismissive. He had spent the entire trial dismissing her as just another single mother, another victim of life's struggles, completely unaware of who she actually was. But now, with her words, the veil had been ripped away. He wasn't facing a woman who had no business being in the courtroom, he was facing the very embodiment of the law itself. Someone who wasn't just capable of understanding the law but someone who had the power to shape it. The realization hit him like a tidal wave. His mind raced, trying to put the pieces together, but it was too late. He could barely process the information, the embarrassment of it overwhelming his senses. He had belittled her, undermined her, made jokes at her expense. And now, as the full weight of the moment crashed down on him, Jimmy felt the sting of his own arrogance. His entire career, the one he had built by cutting corners and exploiting the law for his own gain, was now hanging by a thread. And in front of him, standing tall and unwavering, was the woman who held the power to sever that thread. His face flushed with a deep red of humiliation. The once unshakable confidence he had entered with was now replaced by a crushing weight of fear. What had I done? He had misjudged her at every turn. He had mocked her without knowing who she was or what she was capable of. He had thought that by playing the bully, by belittling someone he assumed to be beneath him, he would win. But now, the tables had turned. The judge wasn't just observing the case from her bench, she was the one who had the power to end it. She was the one who could decide whether his career would continue or be reduced to nothing but a cautionary tale of arrogance and hubris. In that moment, Jimmy realized just how much he had underestimated her. And worse still, how much she now controlled his fate. His career, his reputation, and his freedom were all in her hands, and he had no idea how to get them back. Suddenly, everything shifted. The courtroom, once a familiar and imposing arena where Jimmy had always felt in control, now felt like it was closing in on him. The walls seemed to press in, narrowing the space as if the very air was turning thick with the weight of his impending downfall. Each tick of the clock seemed louder than the last, as Judge Coleman, with unrelenting precision, began to dismantle his case, one calculated question at a time. It wasn't just that she was pointing out flaws, she was surgically exposing the rot beneath every piece of evidence he had so carefully assembled. What had started as a surefire victory, a case he had assumed was already won, was now unraveling before his eyes. Each carefully crafted argument, Each seemingly irrefutable piece of evidence he had believed would seal the deal crumbled like brittle paper under her scrutiny. She was relentless, methodical. No word, no phrase, no gesture escaped her watchful gaze. Jimmy's usual bravado, the arrogance that had always been his shield, began to fade, replaced by a creeping sense of panic that buzzed in the pit of his stomach. His breath, once steady and confident, became shallow as the walls of the courtroom seemed to tighten around him. His heart pounded in his chest, the beat loud and frantic in his ears, drowning out everything but the cold, cutting sound of Judge Coleman's voice. She wasn't just questioning him, she was exposing him for who he truly was. Each of her questions peeled back another layer of his carefully constructed facade, revealing the cracks, the lies, the shortcuts he had taken. His sloppy work was laid bare for everyone to see, his exaggerated claims that he had once delivered with such confidence now sounded hollow and ridiculous. The weight of his own dishonesty crushed him as she exposed the abuse of power that had allowed him to walk away with so many victories in the past. The spectators, who had once sat back with disinterested looks, now leaned forward, their eyes wide with shock and fascination. The mighty Officer Taylor, the man who had strutted into this courtroom with the belief that he could control everything and everyone, was being reduced to nothing more than a stumbling fool. They had all been watching, passively, until they realized the truth of what they were witnessing. The once indomitable officer, who had made a career out of intimidating and overpowering others, was now the one on trial. He was unraveling in real time, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. The silence in the room grew thick, punctuated only by the sharp, steady rhythm of Judge Coleman's voice as she dismantled his case, piece by piece. Sweat now beaded on his forehead, his hands trembling slightly as he clutched his papers, desperately trying to find some way to regain control. But there was no way back. Every word out of Judge Coleman's mouth was like a hammer striking the fragile shell of his defense, cracking it open further. His career, his reputation, everything he had built by walking the line of legality and bending the rules now lay exposed, a fragile house of cards waiting to collapse. He could feel the weight of the room, the eyes of every person in it now fixed on him, not with respect, not with fear, but with pity. The audience that had once watched him with the same passivity with which they watched any courtroom drama now saw him for what he truly was, a man who had overestimated his power, who had thought that the law was something to be manipulated. And now, the law was coming for him. As each of her questions landed like a punch to his gut, the realization settled in with cruel clarity: this was no longer just a trial. It was his reckoning. And with every passing moment, the courtroom was closing in on him, tightening like a vice, until there was nothing left but the uncomfortable sound of his own unraveling. As the case neared its end, the tension in the courtroom was almost unbearable. The air felt thick, the silence so profound that it pressed down on everyone in the room, amplifying the weight of the moment. All eyes were on Judge Coleman as she sat there, poised and unflinching, her presence commanding the space around her. She didn't need to raise her voice. Every inch of her was a force of authority, radiating power with every movement. And then, as if the courtroom had been holding its breath, she spoke. Her voice was calm, almost deceptively so, but each word she uttered struck with the precision of a blade. "Officer Taylor," she began, her tone cutting through the tension like a hot knife through butter. "Your arrogance has blinded you to justice. This courtroom is not a playground for your ego. I suggest, in the future, you remember who you are dealing with." Jimmy's heart slammed in his chest, and for a brief, terrifying moment, he felt his knees weaken beneath him. Her words were a dagger aimed straight at the core of his pride, each syllable embedding itself deep within him, cutting through the arrogance he had worn like armor. The weight of her gaze was suffocating, and when she looked him dead in the eyes, it felt as though she were looking straight through him, past all the bravado, past all the carefully constructed facades he had built up over the years. In that instant, every ounce of confidence he had once held in the courtroom drained away. It wasn't just her words that shattered him, it was the undeniable truth behind them. She was right. His ego had driven him to believe he could bend the law to his will, that he could intimidate and manipulate his way through any situation. But now, standing before this woman, the reality of his misjudgment hit him like a freight train. This wasn't just about losing a case. This was about losing everything he had ever believed about himself. And then, without warning, she brought the gavel down, one sharp, final strike. The sound reverberated through the courtroom, a resounding echo that rang louder than any words could ever achieve. It wasn't just a noise, it was the sound of his world crumbling. The finality of it hit him harder than anything else. The echo of the gavel didn't just resonate in the room, it resonated in Jimmy's mind, playing over and over again as he stood there, frozen, his face flushed with shame and disbelief. His career, his reputation, everything he had ever worked for teetered on the edge of ruin. The courtroom that had once felt like a stage for his performances now felt like a prison, and he was the one behind bars. He had come into this room thinking he could control the narrative, that he could outsmart the system, but now it was clear that the system had outsmarted him. As Judge Coleman stood there, her expression unreadable, Jimmy knew, without a doubt, that this was just the beginning. The walls he had built around himself had crumbled, and now there would be consequences. The harsh reality of justice had arrived, and it wasn't going to show him any mercy. As the courtroom began to empty, Jimmy remained frozen in place, his body stiff and heavy as if the very weight of his shame had anchored him to the ground. His legs felt as though they might give out at any moment, like two wooden beams buckling under an immense pressure. Every part of him was screaming to escape, to leave the suffocating atmosphere behind, but his feet wouldn't move. He had never felt so small, so utterly powerless in his entire life. The usual confidence, the swagger that had once been a permanent part of his identity, had vanished completely, leaving only a hollow, exposed shell. Around him, the courtroom buzzed with a low murmur of approval, whispers spreading through the crowd, moving quickly like wildfire. The spectators, once passive, now spoke in awe, praising the way Judge Coleman had so decisively taken down the arrogant officer. She had been calm, precise, and utterly relentless, tearing apart his case with surgical precision. But it wasn't just about the trial. The admiration in the air was for her strength, her command, her unyielding commitment to justice. She hadn't just bested him, she had obliterated him, leaving no room for doubt about who was truly in charge. Jimmy's stomach churned as the voices around him blended into a blur of contempt. He had underestimated her in the most humiliating way possible, and now the entire courtroom had witnessed his fall from grace. The woman he had once dismissed as nothing more than a frazzled, overworked single mother was no longer just a figure in the courtroom. She was a force that had exposed the cracks in his own self-made empire. The weight of his arrogance came crashing down on him, and with each passing moment, it felt like the walls of the room were closing in on him even tighter. He slunk out of the courtroom, his steps slow and heavy, as if the very act of walking was too much to bear. His badge, once a symbol of power and authority, now felt like a foreign object in his pocket, cold, heavy, and unrecognizable. It no longer held any pride, any meaning. The badge he had worn as a symbol of control now felt like an anchor, dragging him down further into the abyss of his own mistakes. As he reached the doors and pushed them open, he was hit by the sharp contrast between the bustling world outside and the utter isolation he felt inside. He had walked into that courtroom that morning thinking he was untouchable, unbeatable. He had been so sure that the law was something he could manipulate, that his reputation and his position would shield him from any consequence. But now, as the doors closed behind him with a soft click, he realized the truth: he was nothing more than a cautionary tale. The courtroom had not just judged him, it had shattered him, leaving him with nothing but the wreckage of his own hubris. In that moment, Jimmy understood the depth of his own downfall. There would be no easy escape, no way to walk away from the consequences of his actions. His career was hanging by a thread, and he had no one to blame but himself. He had been undone not by a mistake in the case, but by his own arrogance, his own refusal to see the truth. The world he had built had crumbled, and now, all that was left was the bitter taste of regret.